Hi, everyone. We're so excited to have you attend our workshop. Some of you remember that exactly 2 years ago, we partnered with the World Bank and UNICEF to organize a disability inclusive education in Africa learning session that was held in Nairobi, Kenya. It was the first time staff from the Ministries of Education from 12 African countries came together to share technical presentations on data, inclusive education sector analysis, financing, teacher education, and the use of assistive technologies. One of our most important sessions was on data. We were excited that we were able to organize this workshop.
Thank you, Coley. So by today, for our objectives of this workshop, so by the end of it, you'll have recognized the current state of education for children with disabilities and the current quality and availability of existing data in sub-Saharan Africa. We also are looking forward to discussing current and future actions to be taken to support the generation and use of data so that to address inclusive education for children with disabilities. So we are in the first stages of our session, welcome and introduction. We are going to have a series of presentations. You'll have some time for questions and answers, and then we're going to be putting you into small groups so that you can have more detailed discussions. Then we will come back into the plenary and share a bit of the discussion that you had, and then we'll close out for the day. So it's a very full session. We're extremely happy that you're here with us. And in addition to you, we have some technical experts that you're going to hear from. We have Daniel Mont, Mitchell Loeb, Claudia Kappa, and Julia Fleuret. And they will be with us throughout the entire session. They'll be on hand to answer questions, and they'll be available as resource people during the breakout rooms. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dan and ask him to begin his presentation.
It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, talking about what I think is a very important topic. And my job is to summarize very briefly a very rich report done by Encompass for USAID on the state of inclusive education in Africa. The countries in the region have by and large made a strong commitment towards inclusive education. They've all ratified the CRPD, the CRC, and in some countries have gone further in terms of legislation. But as you all know, making a commitment, making a law does not mean you have inclusive education. It's the first necessary step in a number of steps. But one of the important steps is to understand what we mean by inclusive education, because many people still don't really understand. They understand the difference between exclusion, where we keep children with disabilities out of schools, with segregation, where we set up separate schools. But the real place where people sometimes have a misunderstanding is between integration and inclusion. Integration is when we take children with disabilities, we put them in regular schools, but we don't give them the supports they need. We don't structure the classroom in a child-centered way, and quite often it doesn't work very well. Whereas inclusion, we do have those supports. We do have that child-centered, more flexible approach to education that really helps children children with and without disabilities do better. And there's a whole lot written on what inclusive education is. But to get to inclusive education, right, first we need the laws, then we need an understanding of what it is, then we need the money. And there's various approaches to funding it. It doesn't have to be very expensive. There can be steps you can take that are cost efficient, and there's various approaches that I don't have time to go into here, but the report does. Some of them are more centered on children, some of them are more centered on systems, but that's an important thing that we need to consider. So now we have the laws, we have the understanding of what it is, we have the money, now we actually have to try to get the children in school. And right now, the chance that a 12-year-old child with disabilities has ever attended school in the 11 countries in the region is 10 percentage points lower. And you can see across all these countries, there's a gap. The gap can be very large, as it is in Ethiopia. It can be smaller, as it is in Madagascar. We can have a country like South Africa, where we have near universal participation for children without disabilities, but still a very significant lack of participation for children with disabilities. Why are those children not in school? There's a variety of barriers. They could be financial, they could be physical, Physical can also be informational, like Braille and sign language. They could be social. For example, only 48.7% of babies with disability in Uganda are registered at birth, compared to 62% of babies without disabilities. So even the very notion of how a parent interacts with the child and wants the child to participate can be affected right from the beginning because of a disability. But just getting them into school isn't enough. Then we need to get them to complete school. And even when children with disabilities get to school, they drop out at a much higher rate. In one area of Kenya, the dropout rate was 33.3%. Average primary school completion in sub-Saharan Africa are over 10 percentage points lower for girls with disabilities and nearly 13 percentage points lower for boys with disabilities. And I should mention that boys actually have a higher rate of disability, prevalence of disability than girls. So it's even a particularly larger issue for boys. Why do they not stay in school? Well, one of the reasons is a lack of accessibility. That could be infrastructure, that can be the way information is presented, adaptive and inclusive teaching practices, materials, the costs associated with attendance, health and nutritional status. One of the main causes for disability in some areas is nutrition. So we need to address all of these issues in order to help keep the children in school. When it comes to accessibility facilities, again, the report reviews what's out there. In Ghana, in 2018, for example, only 8% of schools were equipped with ramps and hardly any had handrails. And that's only the beginning of accessibility. Then we're talking about toilets, we're talking about lighting, we're talking about modifications to accommodate assisted devices. There's a whole range of accessibility issues that need to be addressed. There's also attitudinal issues. Bullying and violence. 100% of the children interviewed in a number of Southern Africa countries suffer at least one act of emotional sexual violence. This not only leads them to drop out, it also leads them to not attend, because sometimes parents are reticent to let a child go to school if they think there's going to be bullying and victimization. So we get them in school. How do we keep them there? We don't want to just keep them there. We want them to actually learn. And in order for them to learn well, there needs to be instructional accommodation and teacher training. We need to get away from some of those rigid teacher-centered styles of teaching to a more child-centered style. And again, the report talks more about what inclusive education is. Don't have time to go into all that here. We can talk about it more in the breakout sessions if you'd like. Based on a review of 11 countries, only 1 in 10 teachers receive in-service training to promote inclusive education. This is important. It can't be just pre-service training. It must be in-service training, because how a teacher responds to the particular needs of a child is an ongoing thing, and pre-service is not enough. Well, actually, I was going so fast, I actually have a little more time. So 38.3% of teachers who work with learners with learning difficulties have participated in special needs training. Only 59.9% had 59.9% had not had any sort of formal training on how to work with learners with disabilities. And this is not just the teachers, it's also the curriculum, the flexibility of the curriculum. It's also the way students are assessed, the flexibility of assessment, the flexibility of assessment. So USAID is supporting a number of inclusive education initiatives throughout the region, and the report goes on to describe them. This map here shows the countries that they're working in and the types of programs, whether it's adaptive learning, inclusive learning materials, teaching materials. In some places there's awareness raising, distributing assisted devices, promoting enrollment in school, training among parents and family members. I think very important that parents and family members are included in efforts towards inclusive education, and of course teacher training. Well, to run these programs, to understand what the needs are, to understand what the barriers are, what the facilitators to overcoming those barriers are, we need data. And the next presentation is going to talk about that, why data are important for addressing the problems that I've just mentioned in my presentation and the goals that I mentioned in the presentation. So I think I now am supposed to turn it back over to you, Carrie, and look forward to our discussions later in the breakout session.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for attending this workshop. Thanks for listening in. I'd like to talk a little bit following Dan's presentation about tracking inclusion. And this is just going to be a brief summary of a report that you all have access to. And I really encourage you to take a close look at the report. I'm not going to be able to do it justice in this brief overview, but it'll be a good starting point for further discussions about data sources on inclusive education in sub-Saharan Africa. We talked a little bit, touched on the need for and availability of data on children with disability. And we need these data so that researchers and governments can assess the need for interventions, design policies, and evaluate program impacts. And in order to do any of those things or all of those things, we need high quality data, not just any data, but data that is of high quality. And we know historically from data that have been collected in the past that they're rarely or inconsistently available. Very often when data are collected on a population basis, children are not the focus of those data collections. And the needs of children, the needs of education data are not included. When they are collected, those data have often been of poor quality, and that's really a reflection of the questions that are asked. Data is only a product of the answers to the questions that are asked. If we ask inappropriate or bad questions, we're going to get bad data. And we're not going to be able to build policy or really meet the needs of children with disabilities if we're not asking the right questions. Very often these data were not internationally comparable, and that's because different countries use different methodologies, they ask different questions, they have different priorities on their data collection efforts. So there's no consistency across nations, even within a region. Sometimes there's no consistency within a country on data collection efforts. And because of this, because of past understandings and stigma that's been attached to disability, very often these questions relied on derogatory or inappropriate terminology. So global efforts have led to a growing consensus on how to best measure disability in censuses, in surveys, and in administrative data. There's been a need. We've been able to identify that need, and steps have been taken. We're talking about collecting data for quantitative analyses, not qualitative, but quantitative, based on numbers, really looking at basically how many children. Can we identify children who have disabilities in a survey or a census? And this international emphasis on consistency and quality data really began, as far as my personal experience is concerned, around 2001, 2002, when the Washington Group on Disability Statistics was formed to address the shortcomings I just mentioned. And we developed a short set of questions, 6 questions, that was informed by a biopsychosocial model of disability, not a medical model that focuses on diseases or diagnoses or conditions, but more an environment-based assessment of a person's abilities and the environment they live in, what barriers they face. The short set of questions identifies people as having disability if they have either a lot of difficulty or cannot do at least one of 6 very basic universal activities: seeing, hearing, remembering or concentrating, that's cognition, mobility, communication, or self-care. Those are relevant to every culture, every country, every group of people. They could relate to those 6 activities. The questions are meant to be responded to by parents or head of a household, particularly for household members under the age of 18. Adults responded themselves directly, but there were limitations to these questions because they're not entirely appropriate for children under the age of 5. You can look at those activities and see that they're not entirely appropriate. And they would miss children with many developmental disabilities because it's a very limited set of activities. And because of those limitations, the Washington Group partnered with UNICEF to create the Child Functioning module. This module includes 2 separate sub-modules, one for younger children 2 to 4 years of age, and one for children 5 to 17. Again, parents, the mother primarily, or if the mother's not available, the primary caregiver is expected to respond for the child in these modules. And the data is collected and can be disaggregated by types of disability according to the different activities that are focused on: sensory, physical, intellectual, developmental, psychosocial, as well as the degree of difficulty, whether it's some difficulty, a lot of difficulty, or cannot do at all. And these questions would identify the majority of children who are at risk of exclusion because of these functional limitations, but cannot necessarily identify all students or children with disabilities because we don't cover every possible limitation that an individual faces. Data sources on disability: the national census that's done usually once every 10 years. There are large internationally sponsored surveys like the Demographic and Health Survey, Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey. LSMS is the Living Standard Measurement Survey. SINTEF is a group in Norway that's done a number of living condition surveys in sub-Saharan Africa, and school work transition surveys. I'm less familiar with those. Project-based school survey data, which is more limited and can be more focused, and school census data. These are all possible sources of data. The report contains this graph. It's small on the screen, but I encourage you to look at the report. It lists the surveys that I've mentioned and gives some sort of micro information on periodicity, the questions that were used, and what's actually covered in those surveys. And basically, you can see that there is, we are gaining more universal coverage, more comparable data collections on children with disabilities in many different areas. There are continuing data challenges. Many surveys don't include functional modules, functioning modules, so we encourage the inclusion of those. They're easy to encourage, easy to add to any survey. We want to be able to provide for universal coverage. Some of them are only conducted once every 3 to 5 years, and they can have comparability issues depending on sample design, the modules used, or the analysis approach. National surveys and census data for inclusion in education management information systems have issues that are related to quality and reliability. Sometimes derogatory terminology still sneaks into questions, and the accessibility of data is an issue. We want to make it accessible for purposes of analysis and comparability. Project level data, the application and appropriate measurement tools are not always available, and sample size can be an issue. If we have too small sample, we can't analyze the data adequately. So in conclusion, the adoption of the short set or the child functioning module in major international household surveys, like those I mentioned, as well as inclusion of disability-related variables in both national censuses and school censuses and EMIS systems, has improved the ability to track progress and identify areas for improvement in inclusive education through challenges, though challenges still remain. Recommendations: increase sample size, I've told you, including oversampling populations with disabilities, at the country level, increasing, time's up, increasing harmonization, increasing accessibility, and increasing standard reporting. Sorry, it goes quicker than I thought. But at this point, I know we'll have time to discuss later. I'd like to hand over to my good colleague, Claudia Kappa at UNICEF, who will talk about the multiple indicator cluster surveys. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Mitch. Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to join Mitch, Dan, and USAID and others for presenting the work that we have done with the Washington Group to support the development of the module and the integration in the multiple indicator cluster survey. The multiple indicator cluster survey is a household survey program that was developed by UNICEF to help countries collect relevant information on several indicators of well-being for children and their families. Over the last 25 years, mixed surveys have been conducted in close to 120 low and middle income countries and a handful of high income countries as well. And more than 340 surveys have been conducted, in many cases allowing for instance, assessing trends on a number of relevant indicators. In the last round of mixed survey, which is currently on the ground, Mix 6, over 70 countries are collecting data on a number of indicators and also on disability. So both child and adult functioning data are collected through Mix using the Washington Group tools that Mix talked about. So in Mix survey, as part of the standard questionnaire, we have integrated for children under the age of 5 the UNICEF and Washington Group module on child functioning. We have also integrated the same module, but this time the one for children age 5 to 17 in a dedicated questionnaire that is addressed to the mother of children 5 to 17. And then for the adult population, age 18 to 49, in some cases 54, we have integrated the Washington Group short set of questions. From this last round of mixed surveys that, as I mentioned, are going to be implemented in over 70 countries, we already have results that are available for 26 countries, and these results can be downloaded on the Mix website, mix.unicef.org, where you will have access to the actual raw data to conduct all possible analysis that you wish to conduct, and you can also have a look at the country tools, including the original questionnaire and the surveys. When it comes to Africa, we currently have 16 countries that are covered by a Mix 6 survey and will be therefore able to have information on disability. Many of these countries have already released the data sets or are about to release the data sets. In other cases, the countries are still in the process of collecting data. And one of the advantages of the Mix survey is that they allow for the collection of data across a number of different indicators, and this allows for a number of different disaggregation that are very important for understanding the situation of children and adults with disability. Mix, for instance, has a number of different education-related indicators that are collected as part of Mix, including on school participation, school progression, learning outcome, parental involvement with learning and skill development. And when these data are collected together with information coming from the child functioning module, for instance, they are useful to understand, for instance, disparities in access to education, as well as disparity when it comes to the actual progression through the education system. Now, in addition to the module on child functioning, UNICEF and the Washington Group have been working on a module on inclusive education. The purpose of this module is to actually be able to capture the school environment, including attitudes of respondents when it comes to the importance of inclusive education, but also questions that are aimed at describing the school environment for children who are currently attending school, with the aim of understanding what possible barriers exist within the school environment, either in terms of infrastructure or in terms of curricula, that might prevent all children, and particularly children with disability, from fully enjoying their right to education. But there is also a module that looks at reasons for not attending school, and this is of course addressed to parents of children who are currently not in school. So this module relies on parental responses, so offer a parental perspective when it comes to the school environment, the reasons for not being in school. It focuses on formal education and is meant to be used across a variety of school contexts. And this is what makes this module particularly complex to develop, because of course we are trying to measure access to education, we are trying to measure school environment, and as we know, this is very dependent on context by definition. So the testing that is still ongoing really try to minimize the possible negative or biased response to questions, because of course there can be very different interpretation of the concept we are using. So the module has been tested in a number of countries, from Cambodia to India to Kazakhstan to the US, and we would like to do more testing, possibly in an African countries or two, to make sure that the module work well also in other contexts. So the work is very much ongoing. Unfortunately, among many other, of course, negative impact, COVID has also halted the methodological work, and we hope to be able to resume very soon. And lastly, I wanted to show the website, UNICEF data website, which is data.unicef.org/disability, where you will find data collection tools. You will be able to access the child functioning module, for instance, in 9 different languages. You're going to be able to see the manual for interviewers, syntaxes for reporting, some dissemination material. So I hope you will find this resource useful, and I'm going to stop here 3 minutes in advance. I'm going to give the floor to Julia from DHS, and I'm going to be happy to answer any additional question you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. It's nice to be here with you all. I'm with the Demographic and Health Surveys program, which has been around since 1984. We've done more than 400 surveys in 90-odd countries. I'll be talking this morning about our flagship survey, the Demographic and Health Survey, which is a household-based survey, which should be conducted about every 5 years. It's usually done, or it's always done at the behest of the host country government, and it's usually conducted by the country National Statistical Office in close collaboration with the Ministry of Health and with technical assistance from the DHS program. So a little bit of background on the DHS survey. We have standard questionnaires that are adapted to country circumstances and needs. And so those 4 standard questionnaires are the household, where we obtain information about all the household members and characteristics of the household, the woman's questionnaire, and the man's questionnaire, where we interview individual women and men age 15 and above, usually 15 to 49, about their lives and circumstances. And then a biomarker questionnaire, where we collect information on anthropometry and whatever blood tests might be included in the survey. And all of these questionnaires come together to create an enormous range of demographic, health, and nutrition indicators. Our standard questionnaires do include always some education questions. So we always ask about the highest level of education for all household members age 4 and above. And we always ask about current or recent school attendance for all household members age 4 to 24. In addition, in the individual interviews, we determine literacy for women and men age 15 to 49. And a range of other indicators that are related, but not strictly education questions. However, in our standard questionnaires, we do not have any questions on disability or functional limitations. So then the question poses itself, what kinds of disability questions can be included in DHS surveys? I mentioned earlier that our standard questionnaires are customized for a given country or survey. And one of those customizations can be, of course, to add questions on disability. There's two options. The infinitely preferable one is to use standardized modules or sets of questions. Mitch described the Washington Group short set, which we have a module based on it that slots neatly into all of our data collection procedures. Another option would be to include the mixed child functioning questions. I don't think any survey, any DHS has done this yet, but we have often used mixed questions on child labor, child discipline, child development. And so those can also be integrated into a DHS survey based on survey stakeholder interest. The second and less preferable option, and I believe Mitch also touched on this a little bit, is some surveys do include country-specific or what I would call ad hoc questions on disability. This approach does have validity and comparability limitations and is not recommended. So if you go to our website and you search, there's about 38 surveys so far that include some disability data, but only about half of them use any standardized set of questions. And there's 9 recent surveys in Sub-Saharan Africa that use standardized modules. I believe Amy and team will be sharing more information on the specifics after the webinar. So among surveys, DHS surveys that have already happened, how can one obtain information on disability from them? Our final reports contain basic results, the prevalence by some background characteristics, although not notably education. And also the survey final reports do contain copies of the questionnaires, so you can see exactly what questions were asked. Then for a more tailored or deeper analysis, the data sets are available at our website. You can register for access to a specific country or specific survey. The data sets are available in a variety of formats, and we have lots of analysis resources and support available, including a user forum where you can post questions or search for questions that other people have asked on your topic of interest. For surveys that have not happened, how can one advocate for the inclusion of disability questions in them? So the decision to begin planning for a DHS is generally the result of in-country conversations between the country Ministry of Health and the USAID Health Office. USAID is not often the sole funder of a DHS, but often contributes to the funding of it and is very involved in the conversations of the country about deciding to implement a DHS. The specific design of each survey, which includes, of course, the question of what modules or country-specific questions to include, is responsive to the data needs of survey stakeholders. Organizations that are on the survey steering and technical committees are going to have significant input into the survey content. Now, every questionnaire, every survey is a balance between meeting all the needs that stakeholders have and maintaining the overall quality and feasibility of a survey. So not every question that everyone wants to have added can be included. There's an overall, yes, so very few surveys are over-resourced, and every additional feature, adds to the burden of the survey. So all of this has to be considered as a gestalt, and the requests must be prioritized by the survey steering and technical committees. Okay, I have galloped through my slides, so I'm a little bit early, and I believe that I will now hand over to Carrie.
Well, thank you so much to all of our guest speakers. Thank you, Dan, Mitch, Claudia, and Julia. We do have some time for questions and comments, so I'd like to ask participants to either type your questions in the chat box or raise your hand so you can come off mute and speak into the room. When you're asking a question in the chat box, it might be helpful if you say, "This is a question for Claudia," and type in your question. But please do feel free to click on that little hand icon up there and raise your hand so I can see that you have a question, and we have some time for discussion. And for the presenters, do scroll through the questions that are in there. There's some really great questions that have been asked, and you might want to comment on some of the remarks.
Dan has been, hi, it's Mitch. Dan has been really good at following those. I'm a little challenged when it comes to multitasking on these screens, but there have been some really good questions, and I'd like to thank Dan for jumping on them. That was really good. One thing I'd like to mention is, and I might come back to this later, is just sort of the issue of data that is fit for purpose. Making sure that you understand why you're collecting data, and that will lead you to asking the right questions, choosing the right survey modules to collect the right information. Remember, data collection you can't redo. It's not an inexpensive endeavor, and you want to get it right the first time. So take care in planning data collection and choosing the right modules that will fit your purpose. The other thing I just wanted to mention really briefly was talking about inclusive education brings to mind the role of Ministry of Education in particular, and these education management information systems. Dan is better versed on this than I am, but they are a unique and rich potential source of data that can follow a pupil through their entire education to ensure that they get the supports they need to meet their goals. And I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Mitch. Would any of the other presenters like to make a few comments?
Yeah, if I might come in.
Sure.
Here. There was a question about customization for mixed questionnaire and what are the guidelines for customization of mixed by country. There are detailed guidelines on how to customize the mixed questionnaire, and of course the mixed questionnaire covers several topics. So the customization guidelines differ depending on the actual questionnaire and the module that is going to be used in a country. On the website mix.unicef.org, there is a dedicated section of the website that is about the tools the countries need to use for adapting the mixed questionnaire across the different topics to the country needs. So I would suggest visiting that website because there is a dedicated page with customization guidance. Thank you.
And if I can just come in with, since Mitch brought up the EMIS, and it's been going on in the chat as well. Yeah, it's important to, as Mitch was saying, align the data tool with the data purpose well. I mean, EMISs are extremely useful source of information. They can give you a lot more detail. If it's an electronic granular system, we can even follow a child from year to year, and more countries in Africa are moving towards electronic systems. But what the EMIS can't do is talk about the children who are out of school and the reasons why they're not getting into school, because you have to get to school to be in the EMIS. And that's where something like the mix can provide us that information. But what's really important is if the data that's identifying children with disabilities in the mix and the data that's identifying children with disabilities in the EMIS, if the approach is the same, so you're identifying the same types of children, then those two data sources can be used in conjunction with each other, which makes both of them more powerful. If you're using the CFM in the mix, but in the EMIS, you're asking questions like, oh, identify all the children who have disabilities, you're not identifying the same population, and the data can't be used together. So it'd be great if the whole data system, whether it's the DHS, the mix, the census, the EMIS, if they all take a common approach to disability identification, that makes the data all that much more powerful.
Thank you, Dan. Any other questions or comments?
Thanks, Dan. I think that was really a great segue to ask, how do we do that? How do we make all of these, the census, DHS. I mean, I know Julia mentioned that the modules, you can tailor it and ask specific questions, but I've seen in certain countries that it's like back and forth, that there's only a limited number of questions you can ask. And so that's like the difficulty, where you want to ask, a number of questions, like the short set Washington group questions, but you can't, because you're just limited. So any suggestions?
Yeah, well, remember the thing is that there just needs to be some connection, right? So if one tool is using the 6 questions and the other tool is using the CFM, then yes, they're not going to identify the same people, but you can at least understand how they're related to each other, and that helps. So in South Africa, for example, right now I'm working on a project with the World Bank, which is trying to harmonize disability data across the entire government. So Stat South Africa is using the short set and the extended set in some of their tools. And they're trying to, and we talk with every single ministry, that the Department of Basic Education, the Department of Higher Education, the Police Department, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Housing, and gone through it and asked every agency, how are you collecting data on disability and for what purpose, and how can we at least people identify people with disabilities for different purposes. So they're not always going to want to identify the exact same set of people, actually. Some of them are identifying subsets of the whole. But again, the idea is if there's some consistent approach, a functional sort of biopsychosocial approach that like the Washington group has taken, then all that data can be used together. To do it across the entire government is quite an enterprise. But if we're just talking about education, we're talking about the mix and the EMIS. If you just get those two together, and whatever the household living standards survey that goes on in the country, if you just get those few data sources using the same approach, I think it can really help get good data that can really help promote inclusion.
Great, thank you. I see that Wendy just has a question in chat about terminology. Would one of the guest speakers like to answer that question?
I could start. Okay, no, Dan, go ahead.
So I guess the preferred term is disability, but remember, when you're using it, it's not as if you need to label the child as having a disability, right? Especially in a truly inclusive education setting. You're identifying the difficulties. Like, for example, in the Fiji EMIS, which I was talking about in the chat, they go through and they basically use the CFM to identify which children have difficulties in certain areas, what kind of supports they need. Child is never labeled as having a disability. The child's parent is never told the child has a disability. The child's difficulties and needs are identified, and supports where it's possible are given. And I think any word becomes stigmatizing in a stigmatizing environment. In the United States, saying the word special on the playground is actually stigmatizing. I mean, so it's I think, and also one of the problems with special needs is quite often special needs is used to identify children who have gone into a special needs program. And so you'll see data on children from special needs, like in some Western European countries, like this is how many have special needs. And they're not identifying how many children have difficulties doing things. They're identifying children who, for whatever reason, are eligible for specific programs. So I think, and if you ask the people with disabilities themselves, the DPO organizations, I think they would, even in sub-Saharan Africa, I think they would tell you that disability is the preferred word. They're the ones to really ask, right?
Thanks, Dan. We have time for a couple more questions. Can inclusive education replace special education? That's a question in chat.
I'm sorry to come in again, but yes, I think it has to. I mean, that's what's in the CRPD, right? Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This is what the disability community is saying, is that inclusive education is the way to go. When you're talking about special education, you're often talking about segregation. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that doesn't work. Special education is stigmatizing. Special education tends to be of lower quality. Special education is often not community-based education, which means that children tend not to attend school as much when they're not going to a community school. And the idea is that now, can you do inclusive education overnight? Can all, no. I mean, I think there are steps that can be taken anywhere, even in low resource settings, that move in that direction, and that's the direction to go. If you put in special education, what happens is you create a barrier to inclusive education. You create constituencies against inclusive education. You create financial barriers because you've built schools and you devoted certain materials. So I think that I think we need to get away from the notion of special education. And like I said, and if you read the comment from the convention on the committee for the CRPD talking about what is inclusive education and their approach to special and their feeling about what special education is, I think that it's a very strong and very comprehensive statement that's worth reading. Their statement on inclusive education.
Thank you, Dan. We can take another question right before we move into our breakout room activity. If anyone has any final questions or remarks. Is UNICEF doing something in countries promoting special education to boost inclusive education? In Mali, there's special education policy, no inclusive education policy. From Mamadou.
Well, I'm not best placed to comment on UNICEF policy and programs related to inclusive education. I'm only a statistician for UNICEF, but indeed there is a different activities that UNICEF has been undertaking. But again, I'm not best placed to comment on those. But there is a dedicated website, again, under unicef.org, where there is a focus on the activity that UNICEF does with respect to education and particularly on inclusive education. So I can share the resources so that they can be distributed to the participants.
And UNICEF has been doing
I was just going to say, perhaps you could drop that link into the chat.
Will do.
Thank you. So this chat will remain throughout our whole session, so you can continue to type in some questions or comments if you have them. But at this point, I would like to thank everyone for this discussion and move us into our breakout room activity.
Thank you, Carrie. Thanks everybody for attending. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I know we were actually supposed to have this session in person, but as you know, we're not able to do that for at least another year, I think. But maybe we can try to arrange some more sessions so folks can talk to Dan and Mitch, Claudia and Julia, and ask questions. But overall, I think it was a rich session. We're excited to hear from all of you. We plan to follow up with all of your country teams to see what we can do to help at country level. And we're lucky because we have Dan and Mitch who can provide some support to select missions if they're interested. I'd like to give a big thanks to the Encompass team, especially Amy Mulcahy-Dunn, who brought this workshop to reality, Claudia from UNICEF, and Julia from GDHS. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll be in touch through email and I'll follow up. And we also recorded this, so for folks who couldn't attend, please share it with your missions when I send the link. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Yeah, thanks. So long. Bye.